And now we've gone a generation without a gold standard, and look at the results. We have misreported but undeniable inflation. We have a massive money printing airbag from the central bank, expansion of the money supply, which every central banker said has no effect on society, but all that expansion of money supply went directly into inflating the stock market. 90% of stock market wealth is held in the top 10%. It's absolutely corrupted our money, and it's corrupted our society, because now we have grotesque wealth inequality and the highest debt in the history of capital markets. It's not the end of America, it's not the end of the American dollar, but it's certainly the end of its hegemony. And that is not even debatable anymore. We're going into a multipolar, multi-dysfunctional new world order. When we went off the gold standard, the biggest question at the White House and at the Fed with Kissinger and Nixon and the FOMC, they'd walk into the Oval Office every morning and say, what's the gold price? What's the gold price? Why? Because don't let gold get too high. Terrified of gold because gold is honest. And if gold spikes to natural price discovery, the fiat currency looks very embarrassed. And if the fiat currency looks very embarrassed, the government looks very embarrassed, and the jig is up. The LBMA doesn't protect gold, it rigs gold. It's not really a big shocker, but now that the world is in so much disorder and dysfunction because of the loss of faith in fiat money, for a number of reasons we can talk about, that gold is leaving that little fixed COMEX, that little game. And without that gold, the game can't be played as much. And the question now is, with all this, 400 metric tons coming into the COMEX since November, is that meant to reload the guns at the COMEX? They want to prepare themselves when there is a reset, when there is some type of gold-backed new system.
Well, Matthew. Actually, I could say Matt, right?
You can say Matt.
I can say Matt. I could always call him Matthew.
Yeah, I know.
Sounds so formal.
No one calls me that anymore.
No? But now I can call you Matt.
Yep.
It's great to have you again. But
Yes.
then, like 101, we had like 3 roundtable sessions as part of the Future of Finance English edition. That is the event that we organized here in Cape Town. As you can see, with this still like gorgeous, beautiful view.
Yeah.
What a bless. And this is the last interview. And this is an interview, actually part of the bit of a context, also that will be featured, parts of it, in the UMFIF documentary that we are producing, that is about gold and the New World Disorder. So it's going to be a bit of a sneak peek. This time I wanted to actually focus of the resurgence of gold in the monetary system. And for that, maybe, I think it's always nice to first start with the role of gold in the last 200 years, and that's obviously very well known, but what gold had to go through in terms of, on one side, being very central part of it, especially during the Bretton Woods, but also before that, the gold standard from 1871, I think, until 1920 something.
You can go back to the very inception of our country, when it was really at its highest ideals, the founding fathers, and of course the debate between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton about central banks. We can get into that too, but in our very Constitution, before that was amended in 1913 by Woodrow Wilson, when we had the Federal Reserve Act that brought the Fed into fruition and changed the whole status of what is sound money for America. But in our Constitution, there's a section which talks about what Congress's obligations and roles are, and one of them is control over the coinage, and the actual word silver is in the Constitution. So for the founding fathers, and certainly for Thomas Jefferson and all those who met in Philadelphia, it was very understood that we need to have sound money as one part of the thing, and that should be one of the branches of our 3 branches of government that controls that, not a private independent central bank, which I've always said has become a 4th branch of government. So in and of itself, it's unconstitutional. Although if you ever visit Washington, D.C. and you look at the Federal Reserve, it's a very impressive building. It's called the Federal Reserve. It's neither federal nor a reserve, and it's on Constitution Ave in Washington, D.C. So the ironies abound. We've got this beast, this creature from Jekyll Island from the book, that has this imprimatur, this facade of tremendous governmental legitimacy. It's part of our system. It's constitutional because it's on Constitutional Ave. But when Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23rd, 1913 into law, which really was, in my opinion, anti-constitutional from the moment it was born. There's debate about whether this is true or false, and it's a fair debate, but it was later said that that was the darkest day not only of his life, but the life of the U.S. of the United States history. That's a big statement coming from the president. But he said there's a cabal of bankers that you don't even whisper under your breath. That's how powerful they are. Now that's somewhat conspiratorial story, but you go all the way back to that moment from the 1700s to 1913 when the Fed became this fourth branch of government, this independent Fed, this neither federal nor reserve entity on Constitutional Ave, which in my opinion isn't constitutional. That's part of the history of sound money, and it's part of the history of gold in a sense. We're talking about precious metals in our document, silver. But if you go back to the Civil War, the pre-Civil War, you go back to World War I, World War II, of course, Bretton Woods during World War II, and then Nixon welching on the promise in 1971. If you look at the history of the U.S. and other countries, Germany, Prussia, 1870 after the war, whenever things are going okay and you have a sound budget and you want to have sound money, you can have a chaperone to that money and back it by gold. Whenever you need more money than you have backed by gold, then you can peg to gold, then you go off that gold standard. So the moment you're going off a gold standard, that's a sign that you're desperate. In 1944, we were in the tail end of World War II when we met in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods. The countries assembled there, had just a lot to be grateful for, and there was no doubt who was going to be in charge of the post-war reconstruction and the post-war economy, and there was no doubt that the U.S. had a big seat at the table. We were the world's greatest creditor and manufacturer, and despite the debt we had post-World War II, we could say it's going to be a U.S. dollar world reserve currency, and in addition to that, it's going to be backed by gold. Okay, so that we can trust. For a number of reasons, we can trust America. They just saved, with the help of the Soviets, Europe from fascism, and we're going to trust this U.S. dollar. That didn't last more than 30 years, because you fast forward to 1971, Nixon's looking down the barrel of a re-election. He's looking down the barrel of recessionary indicators. That's not good for his politics. It's not good for his power, his election cycle. And so if you have a chaperone on how much you can spend or deficit spend, and that thing is gold, well, what's the first thing you want to do? Get rid of it. And when Nixon made that announcement in 1971, he said, don't worry, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today, and this is a temporary problem. Well, that's the entirety of my life, and we still, that temporary decoupling from gold is continuing to this day, so it's over 50 years. And when he said your dollar will be just as safe today as it is tomorrow as it is today, well, again, measured against a milligram of gold, the U.S. dollar has lost 99% of its purchasing power. So your dollar is not as safe as it was in 1971, and it wasn't temporary because we're in 2025 and we still don't have a chaperone. So it was a lie, just a lie. And so, as we were talking about with Francis earlier, gold is honest. Not many things, but it's honest. And that's why fiat money is kind of a facade of dishonesty, and it's always decoupled from gold when you're desperate, like Nixon was before. This is before Watergate. And we saw that again during periods of war and during periods of boom and bust. Depending on how things are going, you can go back to sound money when you're not in debt over your ears. But the moment you're going to go deficit spend, usually for political power, to buy votes, to buy time, to buy the fantasy that you can spend and create and debase your currency and expand your money supply with no consequence, that buys votes for a time, that buys popularity, that gets you out of trouble. I mean, if any of us had a money print in our basement and we had a mortgage to pay or tuition to pay or a major debt and we could legally use it, we'd be very happy to do so. That's counterfeit and that's illegal, but if you're the Federal Reserve or you're the U.S. president and you've got the power of the Congress behind you to amend the Constitution, you can do whatever you want until it doesn't work anymore. And so that slow drip depreciation of the purchasing power of the dollar since 1971 is now actually coming home to roost. I mean, we're talking 50 years later. I mean, von Mises wrote about this in 1950. So you can cry wolf. It's been a slow drip destruction of the currency, but now it's really coming to an obvious head. And I guess it's a long way of saying The gold, no gold started from the very beginning of our Constitution to today. It's fluctuated up and down throughout history. Bretton Woods was the last time we really tried to puff our chest and show we're going to have sound money. That didn't last even 3 decades. And now we've gone a generation without a gold standard, and look at the results. We have misreported but undeniable inflation. We have a massive money printing airbag from the central bank, expansion of the money supply, which every central banker said has no effect on society, but all that expansion of money supply went directly into inflating the stock market. 90% of stock market wealth is held in the top 10%. So we've inflated a massive asset class and risk assets, and particularly a NASDAQ and a Dow and an S&P that seems to be immortal. And what has that done? It's absolutely corrupted our money, and it's corrupted our society, because now we have grotesque wealth inequality and the highest debt in the history of capital markets. So no, it didn't work. And as I've said many times, modern monetary theory, this idea that you can solve a debt crisis with more debt and monetize that debt with artificial money, that's neither modern nor monetary nor theory. It's been tried throughout history, and it always fails. Even the Romans started with silver and the denarius, and it slowly got chipped away over a period of about 250 years, which is about the average life cycle of an empire. So again, it's not the end of America, it's not the end of the American interest, it's not the end of the American dollar, but it's certainly the end of its hegemony. And that is not even debatable anymore. We're going into a multipolar, multi-dysfunctional new world order. And I don't think that's even a debate anymore. That shouldn't even be a gold bug or precious metal argument. It should be an understanding of history and sound money. And that's my long answer to a short question.
And so what do you think drove the massive demonetization of gold after like the 70s, especially when we look at, for example, Canada?
Well, listen, gold terrifies politicians and liars, left, right, or center. And, you know, there's a great book called 6 Days in August. I mean, when we went off the gold standard, the biggest question at the White House and at the Fed with Kissinger and Nixon and the FOMC supermen was, they'd walk into the Oval Office every morning and say, what's the gold price? What's the gold price? They were worried that when they decoupled, that there would be a tremendous lack of faith now in this unchaperoned fiat money, and that there'd be a rush to gold. And so their biggest concern is don't let the gold price go too high, because if that happens, we don't look so good anymore. Our monetary policy doesn't look as trusted. We look like the fraudsters and counterfeiters that we really are. So we have to worry about the gold price. A rising gold price is a neon flashing sign that you're not to be trusted. And so when we decoupled from gold in 1971, it was absolutely no coincidence that Kissinger was running around the Middle East trying to get a petrodollar, so that if you link the dollar to oil and the whole world has to buy oil in dollars, that creates a natural demand or a forced demand for the US dollar. That keeps it from over-inflating and debasing. And at the same time, within a few years of Kissinger basically forcing that on OPEC, you know, very smart guys like Malamud and even a young Greenspan and a young Milton Friedman were saying, hey, let's put futures and gold. Let's put futures contract. Let's create this thing, a futures contract. That's the current, you know, COMEX, which is really just a very fancy, complicated way of using derivative instruments to lever physical gold at massive ratios of paper contracts to physical gold, to basically get up every morning and make sure there's a number of large levered super shorts on the precious metal price. And so again, why? Because don't let gold get too high. Terrified of gold because gold is honest. And if gold spikes to natural price discovery, the currency, the fiat currency, looks very embarrassed. And if the fiat currency looks very embarrassed, the government looks very embarrassed, and the jig is up. And of course, what we're seeing now with the COMEX, these outflows, these extraordinary outflows, which are far too complicated for the average man or woman on the street to follow. What we're seeing is that system of artificial legalized price fixing at the COMEX is slowly but surely having a tipping point right now. And it's terrifying for a lot of people. Does that mean we're going to have natural free price discovery in gold this week? No, but again, as we talked about this morning, there's a lot of different ways to look at the ounces, the millions, the billions. But to keep it in perspective, because it gets wonky, the COMEX is not a gold market, it's a credit market. It's not about storing safe gold. It's not meant to be delivered. It's meant to be rolled over and shorted. So when you see in a COVID crisis, for example, there was nations and counterparties wanting physical gold. Things were looking scary. And so 9 billion in gold went out of the COMEX, which was pretty unthinkable. That was pretty scary. But in just the last few weeks, 21 billion has left the COMEX. You got to think about that. From COVID to today, we're talking massive outflows. Why? Because counterparties no longer want to extend and pretend the short on the COMEX. They want that physical tier one real money, that real strategic reserve asset back within their own control, within their own zip codes. So the COMEX price fixing is seeing a real game-changing moment right now. And again, for the man on the street, that's very complicated stuff. Futures contracts, forward contracts, COMEX, levered paper, Basel III accords that came just before. It's all meant to be confusing. But what it boils down to in simple terms is there's not enough physical gold in that casino in New York to keep this game of levering and shorting the actual natural free market price discovery of gold. And now that gold is leaving the warehouses through Globex and the COMEX, and it's going to wherever the counterparties want it, which is within their own control. Because they see the direction of the hockey puck. They see the direction of this new world disorder. They are preparing now, like any army prepares before battle, to get their ammunition and their cannons loaded and ready. And what are they doing financially? They're reloading that gold supply. And again, they're not doing crypto, they're not doing Bitcoin, they're not doing Ethereum. Not against them, just saying this is the true strategic reserve asset. They want to prepare themselves when there is a reset, when there is some type of gold-backed new system, not a gold-backed world reserve currency, but maybe a gold settlement or a gold priority. Even the IMF has talked about central bank digital currency has to be pegged in some way to gold, has to be correlated to gold in some way to have legitimacy. And so they're just preparing for the chaos to come. And he who has the most gold wins, has more control. And Kissinger was very against revaluing gold in Europe in the 70s because he knew that if we actually did an audit and revalued gold, we may not have the most. And if you look at what China has in real gold as opposed to what's reported, if we do revalue gold and make it a more necessary part of international trade settlements like the BRICS are doing, and we make it a more necessary part of sound money, countries like China and Russia are probably going to be a little stronger than they were yesterday in terms of credibility with their monetary systems. Again, doesn't mean China and Russia are the best places to live, or they're going to replace the dollar or invade San Diego. It just means they're playing a longer term game of chess while we've been playing checkers like guys like Nixon, to stay in power, to stay elected, to deficit spend to no end, to look like it's a robust economy. But an economy flying under these wings, when the rotten wind beneath those wings is just debt, monetized by paper money. That's not sustainable. We've been talking about this for 20, 30 years, but now it's no longer theoretical, it's no longer crying wolf. We're seeing it play out in real time, and we have been for months. And it's again, not the end of the world, but a very different world.
Sorry to interrupt this episode, but I'd like to tell you more about what we do at GoldRepublic. At GoldRepublic, we provide physical gold, silver, and platinum, fully insured, fully in your name, fully allocated, in top-tier vaults, security saved in Amsterdam, Zurich, and Frankfurt. No paper promises, just real ownership, full transparency on your name. We are fully regulated and conduct regular independent audits of our vaults with more than 700 million euros of precious metals under custody and 70,000 investors that trust us in the last 15 years. Our top-rated app gives you full control. Track live prices, explore detailed charts, and buy or sell in just a few taps. Whether you're hedging against inflation, currency risks, or financial stability, at GoldRepublic, we offer real assets to safeguard your generational wealth.
So you wrote extensively about actually like the suppression of gold, and that's also something that in most cases in the industry, some people like to talk about it, some people don't, because some people also think it's speculation. But you really wrote extensively about it, you've been able to document it, you wrote many pages about it. Let's dive into that. How exactly does since the 70s, did actually in detail the gold suppression mechanism work?
Well, and again, without getting wonky, in simplest terms, so and also without being sensational, the futures market means you have to have a certain amount of collateral, and then you can use a certain amount of leverage on that collateral to go long or short an asset. It can be pork bellies, it can be wheat, it can be grain, it can be cattle, it can be any copper, zinc, it can be any commodity. But when you actually talk about in the precious metal space, starting in the 1970s, starting in 1974, again, Leo Malamud, Milton Friedman, a young Alan Greenspan, they came up with this brilliant idea to make a casino out of, make the futures market leverage with precious metals. And so think about what that means. We have X amount of gold on the COMEX, and with that X amount of gold, we're allowed to use X amount of leverage, sometimes 100 to 200 times leverage in the 70s and 80s, to go long or short gold. But what did they do? They weren't going long gold. The actual number of long contracts by most players on the COMEX was far outnumbered the short contracts. But those that were going short were these large, too big to fail central, or not central banks, but big banks. And what were they doing every morning on their prop desk? They were levering the heck, or I want to say the hell, out of gold. And they were levering it short, not long. In other words, they were putting a boot to the neck from day one on the natural long contracts that were going long gold. They were far surpassing those on the short contracts by hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars a day. And so billions now. And that worked for decades, for almost my entire life. That constant game that's legitimately a short contract, it's legitimately a certain ratio of paper contracts against a small amount of gold. And what happened recently, and I was writing about this years ago, I said that is what it is. It will change, though, when that system breaks down for any number of reasons. Well, then Basel III came along and they said, you big banks, you have to have you have to have more allocated, segregated gold, even on the COMEX. You have to have enough gold on your books, not hyper levered, not hypothecated, not leased out. You have to have a higher amount of segregated gold on your accounts now. So that was already the first kind of red flag in this game that I've been tracking for years. And okay, now we have to have more gold to lever. And now we have to have at least 4% physical gold. We can lever 96% paper on that, but we can still get up every morning and go short gold legally with these contracts. And every time those contracts come to what's called, fruition, come to an end, we'll just extend them or repurpose them again, roll them over. And the cost of rolling them over, extending them, is almost free for the big players, the big bullion banks, the big names. And again, that game just continued. What's happened in the last 4 weeks, last 6 weeks in the headlines is that gold necessary post-Basel III to use to lever those contracts is leaving the COMEX. It's walking out the door. So you can't price fix as much if you don't have the gold there. And it's leaving the door because other counterparties, instead of extending these contracts or renewing these contracts for free, are taking it out. They're just taking it out of the casino, so you can't play those chips anymore. And that's a major change. Many people say that's not price discovery, it's just free market capitalism, it's just going long or short using derivatives. That's what Wall Street does. Again, that was meant to help farmers fix a price on beef or hay. So if there was a storm or a foot and mouth disease, you could hedge and you could protect yourself. It wasn't meant to price fix precious metals, but that's what they did with it. And legally, technically, it's correct, but what it goes back to is that original question. It is an instrument with a lot of wonky math and derivatives to basically keep a permanent short going on the gold price, so it can never run uphill, because it's always running uphill in roller skates against these shorts, always. And although there is certainly price movement in gold from 1974 to today, it's not nearly what it would be if there was absolutely natural supply and demand driven forces, without derivatives and without these big shorts. And if you look at the articles that I've written from 2021 to today, you can see the ratios, you can see the banks involved, you can see the charts. It's appalling, the amount of shorts that were going on. And anyone who understands the commodities market and the COMEX or even the Merc in Chicago knows how this is played. The problem is most people don't. Why should they? I wouldn't. If I were a dentist or a plumber or a doctor or even, a car mechanic or even someone who gave financial advice with 60-40 portfolios, I wouldn't really look into the COMEX or the futures or forward contracts in the New York Exchange or what goes on between London and New York. It's very wonky. And in puts and calls and leverage and paper and ratios, it's all very wonky. It's not meant to be discussed. But anyone who understands the commodities market and how it's played, that shouldn't be a big conspiracy theory. It's pretty simple. And that system, I warned starting in 2020, will last as long as it lasts. And I didn't know how to predict the end, but I knew it would come when there was a greater desire to get that gold off the COMEX. Because it's really not even a gold market, it's a credit market where gold is at the bottom of it, but it really wasn't for protecting gold. The LBMA doesn't protect gold, it rigs gold. It's not really, to me, a big shocker. But now that the world is in so much disorder and dysfunction because of the loss of faith in fiat money for a number of reasons we can talk about, that gold is leaving that little fixed COMEX, that little game. And without that gold, the game can't be played as much. And the question now is, with all this, 400 metric tons coming into the COMEX since November, is that meant to reload the guns at the COMEX, or is that just meant to make delivery so they can meet their delivery orders? Because technically, if the gold stays in the COMEX, they can continue this game. But I think it's not just being reloaded so they can continue the short. It's being brought into the warehouses so they can make delivery and not be in default. And we'll see how that plays out. I can't predict it, but I'm seeing real symptoms of a sickness in the COMEX, and that's scary. And that's why everyone's rushing to buy gold right now. Central banks, since we weaponized the dollar in 2022 against Russia, again, we've gone from 118 tons a year in central banks purchasing of gold to 290 tons now. Again, I'm not making these numbers up. Why are they buying gold? Why did someone just buy 30 million ounces of gold in the US recently? It's probably a bank, probably not an individual. That's about 90 billion bucks. Why? Why are the Eastern central banks stacking physical gold at record levels right now? Why did the BIS make gold a tier 1 asset a few years ago, before this happened? They are looking at the direction of the hockey puck. They think it's just among them that they know, but more and more people, because of platforms like this and conversations like this and articles like that, and not just me, but many others, are kind of catching on that this gold is really important. He who has the most marbles wins, he who has the most gold wins. These countries are seeing the decline in fiat money. They're seeing the weaponization of the dollar. They're seeing the debt levels of the US. They see its US Treasury isn't as respectable. They see the risks in that, and they're trying to prepare for the snowstorm before the snow. They're trying like a squirrel to gather the nuts before the winter, or a bear before it hibernates, or an army before combat. They're trying to reload the safest, best asset they can to protect themselves from a free fall in fiat money. And that best protection is that pet rock, that analog, sits there, does nothing, stares back at you from a hole in the ground. That asset, gold. And yeah, gold does do nothing. It sits there and stares back at you. Fiat money is very, very busy being swapped, levered, traded, debased. And gold has been very busy doing nothing but one thing: holding its purchasing power, holding its value. It is a store of value. And I can give you 1,000 examples of how that's true. But central banks of the world know it. I'm not a big fan of central banks. The BIS knows it. Not a big fan of the BIS at all. But whether you love them or hate them, I know why they're doing this. And I certainly know why Russia and China have been stacking gold really since 2014. And central banks of the world have been net stacking gold since 2014 and net dumping US Treasuries. Again, boring fact, massive implications behind that. Massive. And so again, it shouldn't even be a gold bug argument. It's just an understanding of politics, sound money, and currency debasement. And again, I came up through Wall Street in the dot-com bubble. I was a bond jock. I was long, short, risk asset stocks and bonds. I wasn't a gold guy. I didn't come to gold because I wanted more jewelry or wanted to make a statement. I came to gold because however much money you have and whatever currency you measure it in, that fiat money is like a beautiful ice cube that's losing its purchasing power. It's losing its inherent value. And I came to gold because, well, what else am I going to do? Where else am I going to go? You can buy farmland. Yes, you can buy art. You can try and find some hedge against the debasement of your currency. But for me, I went back to the history books, went back to von Mises, listened to Egon von Greyer's for years. And I said, yeah, gold makes sense. It's not going to make me richer, but it'll keep me from getting poorer. Yeah, I'd love to see the price appreciation. That's fantastic. You can talk about year over year, huge number of gains in gold price. Love it. But I never look at the gold price, never once. As all I know is the gold price for me is going to go higher than the value of my US dollar or my Swiss franc or my euro. That I just know. Not in a straight line, not every day, but there's no doubt when I measure my wealth, I'd rather have it in that indestructible pet rock than in something digital or something paper.
I actually remember you just quoted Egon von Greyerz, with whom you work. Mm-hmm. And there was an article that was last December on Zero Hedge. Actually, the source was a COMEX trader that wanted to remain anonymous. Mm-hmm. Before all the things that we've seen with the Bank of England and the COMEX happening. Mm-hmm. And the quote was, there's nothing more than half-eaten IOUs and muffs in Fort Knox. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And now Trump and Elon want to kind of live stream through, go take a live stream and see what is in there. Yeah. But as you mentioned also earlier, there's no incentive doing that if you don't know what the answer is. Yeah. But that ties back maybe to actually strengthening the position that they might have it, right? I mean, there's no other alternative.
Yeah, I don't know. Is it 8,132 tons of gold or not? I don't know. It could be more, it could be less. We'll find out. I certainly wouldn't ask that in a public forum unless I knew the answer. Like I wouldn't cross-examine a witness out of law school if I didn't know the answer. But what I do think I do know is whatever the number is, even if it's twice as much as we think we have, maybe it's 16,000 instead of 8,000. What I'm pretty confident of is China has a lot more than us. That I'm pretty confident of. They're the world's largest gold producer and the world's largest gold importer. They even encourage their citizens to have gold accounts at banks and to buy gold. We've encouraged citizens to take on debt to buy jet skis and Ford 150s. We've encouraged them to become serfs in our feudalistic society that masquerades as capitalism, where the top 10% like me look down on a middle class that's dying and the really, really poor that just take handouts. So it's a sickening system. And I came from a very middle class, lower middle class background. I don't say this in any smug way. Our clients are high net worth individuals, but I'm talking 99% of the time to people from my hometown. That's who I'm thinking about. And I'm very glad to help the wealthy stay wealthy. And I'm evangelical about helping the poor, at least if they can, get some gold. Not to get rich, but protect them from getting more and more debased and more screwed and more poor. It is in some cases a little bit too much too late though. But for those, I've talked to people, I talked to guys in their 20s and 30s who make 50,000 a year and they've been buying gold for the last 5 or 10 years. I'm very grateful for that. I'm very glad of that. I'm not trying to make them Bitcoin millionaires. I'm not trying to make them NVIDIA champions. Some of them wish they had. But these people that have been carefully just accumulating gold are just trying to protect their own currency because their central bankers won't do it for them.
And if we look now at the BRICS accumulation, and obviously now I repeat kind of like we talked about this also before, is that we see kind of a readjustment of reserves globally, also spread out through the major powers like Russia, China, even India, who actually it's quite interesting because historically, at least the government and the central bank of India actually was very gold averse. They very Keynesian, but its population very much gold lovers actually. And even they now start. I think you mentioned that also in our last interview. Repatriating the gold reserves back to their own vaults and the zip code, as you always say. So we see like this massive rebalancing in a time where the dollar is showing strength, but not for too long. In a time where tariffs deglobalize world trade. So can we say that there's maybe like some sort of rebalancing of the financial system?
And the irony is it's the ones we look down upon that are thinking longer term and getting the last laugh. I mean, literally, Indian housewives have more gold than the Bank of England. And you know, we laugh at these emerging market economies, these silly economies, and yet that's a simple fact. And you think about it, in 1990, Gordon Brown basically got rid of the gold because things are great now. And 1990 is an interesting year because that was the year I think I was a sophomore in college, and this famous book came out called The End of History, The Last Man by Francis Fukuyama. I would think I was a sophomore in college. I was a history major. I was an economics major. I remember looking to my wife and saying, you know, this is an interesting book because the book is saying, well, you know, the walls come down, the Wiedervereinigung, as we say in Germany, the East and West are linked. Soviet Russia is gone. Free market capitalism has survived, and liberal democracy has, in a Hegelian kind of dialectical way, is now here to stay. We can all breathe a huge sigh of release because capitalism and democracy have gotten the last laugh. But even as a 20-something in college, before grad school, before anything else, before the Wall Street, I remember telling my wife, that's a little bit hubris. Pride cometh before the fall. That this is the end of history. That was, I hate to say, it's over 30 years ago now. And in one generation, look what's happened since 1990. It is not free market capitalism. It is not liberal democracy that's the champion. And the irony is, in that one generation, in that 30 years since I looked at that book, in a lot of ways, America is more and more broke, and democracy is more and more diluted, and capitalism is more and more kind of become feudalism than ever before. Again, I'm not saying that Soviet or communist systems are better or that they're coming to replace it. I'm just saying this idea of a victorious capitalism and a victorious liberal democracy is now clearly not looking as shiny as it did in 1990. But Gordon Brown and others thought, we don't need gold anymore because everything's fine. Russia's gone, China's a joke, India's not important, we're all that matters, we don't need this. That goes to those cycles of gold and no gold. And Gordon Brown, hell, I'll sell some gold, I'll make some money, I'll stay elected. He was thinking 5 seconds ahead, like a typical Western politician. Whereas the Chinese, the Russians, and the Indians, wherever you think of them, are thinking decades ahead. And this is the hubris. This is that Hochmut kommt vor der Falle, you know, that arrogance before the fall. And I would much rather live in Virginia than St. Petersburg, much rather live in Michigan than Shanghai. I'm not saying that as an anti-American. And I think there's going to be a real call, you know, come come to Jesus moment, so to speak, with our sound money. I think there's going to be a real reckoning. And I think America and the West can overcome this, but not before there's a large amount of mess and stress and rethinking and honesty about the adversity and austerity that's coming that we have to face before we can bring back manufacturing, bring back our debt levels to something that's reasonable. But you can't get there in one term, and you can't get there for free, and you can't have that without pain. And a politician that says that honestly without debasing the currency or going to war to distract you will be the thing that saves the West. I'm not expecting much of that from the current administration in England at all. So in a lot of the EU countries, will Trump do it? I've said many times, it's not anti-Trump or pro-Trump. Santa Claus can't do that. No one can. Mother Teresa can't do it. A stack of Nobel Prize winners can't do that. You cannot do that in 2 years or 4 years. And the irony is, if we really want to see that we're doing the right thing, we're going to have a recession. We're going to have austerity. We're going to have to cut spending. We're going to have to suffer. The sad reality is, the ones that are going to suffer the most are the ones that have been suffering already. And the ones that will suffer the least are the guys that have a house in Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Palm Beach. Yeah, it'll still hurt. Taxes might be higher. Inflation will eat away at some of their wealth. Maybe their kids won't get 3 new cars on their birthday or 2 new cars. But I mean, that class of people, cry me a river. But the real people that are going to get hurt are the people that can barely get by as it is. And that's where you have the social unrest that often comes from this austerity. And that's where you risk more centralization from your government as you're going through that period. Or as Hemingway said, possibly more war.
Do you also see, in terms of the BRICS, the use of gold is something that we also mentioned before, the fact that it's not necessarily going to be used as a gold-backed currency, but as an international settlement system.
Right.
How would it work beyond what's already being used with the example that you always mention about Russia and China? Enbridge as well was one of the examples now that recently was actually settling some of the transactions for oil in renminbi, I think. So looking into the future now, how do you envision that future with gold as an international settlement method?
Yeah, it's it was a couple of years ago, the first meeting in South Africa where the BRICS met, and there's headlines and hype. And in the gold industry, there's plenty of hype, plenty of fear, plenty of nonsense, really, Unsen. And yet, the BRICS in South Africa are going to announce a gold-backed BRICS currency, and woe be to the rest of the world, and this is going to happen. It was so naive and so sensational. That's not going to happen overnight, and it certainly isn't going to be a BRICS currency that's going to compete with the US dollar, and certainly not then and not today. What was more interesting is what happened in 2024 when they met in Kazan, or they met in Russia. And that was this idea, this Enbridge, this idea that we'll have a 60-40 kind of unit of account that will be 40% backed, or 40% included in precious metals and gold, and 60% in your local currency, not a yuan forced currency. And that gold isn't redeemable in Shanghai or Moscow. It's just an escrow in your own zip code, so you don't have to get rid of your gold. And we're going to use that not as a BRICS currency, but as a trade settlement currency. So you can still, in Vietnam or in Russia or China, you can still debase your currency locally if you want. But when it comes to trade, you got to have some of this gold in there, and it's going to be a unit of account for trade. It wasn't about a BRICS-backed gold currency, because every sovereign nation still wants to have its right to debase its currency or tighten its currency. It was actually a brilliant model, and I think the BIS had this idea of a trade settlement solution. It wasn't a BRICS-backed currency that came out in 2024. The BRICS had this idea. And the BIS actually was behind this, and then suddenly the BIS kind of pulled out of this notion, this Enbridge thing that they were trying to do with the BRICS, which was interesting because originally they were for it. And then I think they must have gotten a call from DC or Paris and said, oh, you don't forget that the B in the BRICS, or the R, in the BRICS is Russia and the C is China. We really shouldn't do this yet. They're not ready to, the BIS wasn't ready to support it. But you get a sense of what the BRICS are trying to do in 2024. You see where they're looking. And what was even more interesting about that is the UAE and Saudi Arabia were at the table also saying, yeah, we're willing to do this. with oil as well. We can come up with a way to use this type of unit to transact oil outside of the dollar. Again, that's a massive, massive implication. If you start slowly trading outside of the US dollar for oil, and you start doing local trade settlements outside the US dollar in local currencies and in gold, net settling and trade, not in a BRICS-backed currency, but in a trade settlement way. Again, I've used the yuan and the oil trade example of Russia and China many times, but this is scalable between any of these members. And that's what you're thinking. And the fact that Saudi Arabia and UAE were there at the table, rolling up their sleeves and ready to do it, and I've joked, I've said this at times, if your girlfriend's at dinner and she's looking at the waiter more than you may not have a problem yet, but you're gonna have a problem in the relationship. We're not talking about the end of the petrodollar yet, but the fact that these oil states are really happy to discuss going outside of the US dollar to transact oil says a lot about the next 20 years of where the world's going. And that's a whole other conversation on oil and gold, but that's fascinating too.
So do you see also the use of, I wrote about this in an article, as theoretically a BRICS-backed basket of currencies with gold, like the 40-60%, could also reduce up to 2% of transaction costs just in terms of intra-BRICS trade.
Sure.
And actually save like up to, I think, 7 billion in just transaction costs per year. And would you see that as something that could work, and by using some DLT, like distributed?
Whatever you think of DLT, it's coming. It's not going away. And we can talk about what's good or bad about it, but certainly what's good about it is its speed and its efficiency and its cost. And again, I don't think that genie goes back in the bottle now. The digital ledger technology is extremely efficient in that regard. And I don't want to say I know for sure, it's a mug's game to predict, but I think that clearly is the direction. It's not just for cost efficiency, it's also just transactional efficiency. And it's also just the new direction. Again, it doesn't mean the end of the dollar, it just means a new direction away from the dollar that, well, the dollar is still a player, but these other kind of tokenized DLT-based, local currency, gold-based tokens can be used to do trade that doesn't require the U.S. SWIFT system, which can be frozen, as we saw in 2022, doesn't require the approval of a U.S. banking system, and doesn't require the involvement of the U.S. dollar. And so that is the slow drip away. It is a slow drip away from a dollar and a U.S. Treasury that for a generation has been the tail that wags the dog of the rest of the world. And the reason that tail is no longer as strong, and the reason that the dog is getting more recalcitrant and more rebellious, there's a number of reasons. The main reason is that tail, that U.S. tail that's wagging the dog of the rest of the world, is too much in debt, not as credible. The second reason is they weaponized what was supposed to be a neutral world reserve currency against a political antagonist. And so other countries are saying, well, if they can do this to Russia, they can do it to me. I mean, we get that they did that to Venezuela and Iran, but now they're doing it to Russia, nuclear power. It's like I've said many times, if you have a bank account at a local bank and they freeze, if I had a bank account at Goldman or Citibank and they froze my assets, I'm not going to recommend it. Again, tired example, but it's so simple. And when we weaponized that dollar, it was a watershed moment. Probably one of the biggest mistakes in the State Department since the inception of the US government. I'm not alone in that opinion. Well, now the dollar's not as trusted and the dollar's over its skis in debt. Those are two reasons to look at something else. Again, not replacing the dollar, not the ruble as a world reserve currency, or not the yuan, certainly not the real. It's just a slow seismic directional shift away. It's not a coincidence, given the weaponization of the dollar and the debt levels of the U.S., that we're not the U.S. we were going back to Bretton Woods, 1944. We're not even the U.S. we were in 1971 under Nixon. We're not a terrible country. I love America. I'm an American. I always will be. I'm a capitalist, but we don't have the America that I grew up in. We don't have the America of our founding fathers. We don't have the capitalism that I studied in school. We just don't.
If you remember, like President Xi and President Putin met a few years back, and there was something that I think Xi said to Putin, saying that the two countries will do things that has not been seen in 100 years, with change that has not been seen in 100 years. That was a very strong statement, especially coming, I think, and that was Xi saying that, especially coming from a Chinese president, who usually always talks in a bit more cryptic ways, I would say. That is very telling, and some people just like Zoltan Postwar wrote as well about the revaluation potentially of gold as kind of coming into like what also Willem Middelkoop, who wrote most of the reports with David March, the big reset.
Yeah.
Do you see something that now talking about all the things that we had with the BRICS, rebalancing their gold reserves, having even maybe more than the Western G7 countries. Is there maybe like a play at hand to actually force this reset and having gold as a way of reevaluating all those balance sheets?
The short answer is yes. When you talk about Xi and Putin saying we're going to change the world, these two countries over the next 100 years are going to change the world. Again, should have to caveat. This is not me saying I'm pro-Putin or pro-China. But you have to respect your adversary financially or militarily if you're going to go into combat or you're going to have a currency war or a trade war. You have to respect them. What I respect about, and it's not oligarchies and totalitarianism, and I certainly don't want to live in Shanghai, like I said again, or St. Petersburg. But you have to respect the long-sighted, far-sighted mentality of China and Russia. Cultures and traditions that are used to suffering and used to patience and used to thinking longer term. I don't think that going away from the dollar in 2022 after it was weaponized was plan B, that they had to come up with a better solution. We have to come up with some BRICS trade settlement idea. We have to come up with an M bridge in Kazan, or we have to quickly come up with a way to get around the dollar. They've been thinking about this for generations. And it was never a plan B to come up with the anti-dollar trade settlement idea or a BRICS union or some way to do things away from the dollar. It was plan A all along. They needed the pretext geopolitically, that final straw on the camel's back to do it. And 2022 was that final straw. Again, not talking about Zelensky or Putin or picking sides. I'm saying whatever you think of that war, weaponizing a neutral reserve currency to punish one of the players in that was a massive mistake, because that raised eyebrows around the world. But again, since 2014, these central banks, these large countries, especially the East, have been stacking gold very quietly. Now it's much more openly and much more loudly, because all along they've been playing this. And again, as Kyle Bass said years ago, what's one of China's main concerns is a non-dollar energy solution. They need to be able to, they're a major importer of oil. China they import food, they import energy. Their water supply has problems. Their demographics are awful. Their banking system. I'm not saying China is great, but one thing they definitely need to do is not rely on U.S. Treasury and U.S. dollars to get energy, especially when they're neighbors with Russia that has a lot of energy to sell. So these things have been in motion for years. No one's paid attention because we're too busy being proud of America and our debt-based solutions to everything. Solve a debt crisis with more debt, buy another Ford 150 again. Watch the Super Bowl. Watch Friends, be distracted by transgender bathroom debates and whether BLM is what MLK really wanted, and all these crazy, I don't want to say woke, but all these distractions. We're literally playing chess as Rome burns on distractions, while China and Russia and the East are getting their ammunition, their financial ammunition in play. They're getting their gold. Their central banks are getting their gold. It's been happening right under our eyes in plain sight, and now it's accelerating because the direction of the problems, the disorder that you're talking about, the global disorder, is accelerating. And again, for anyone paying attention to gold flows, even just in February, I'm in Switzerland. It's 193 tons went from Switzerland to the U.S. None went to China. Was that an agreement that Switzerland made with the U.S. to help give America a little bit of a break? I don't know. But I'm watching the flow of gold. Like I'd be watching the flow of an army approaching my border. I would be making decisions based on what those flows mean. And if you're watching the flow of gold to countries like India, China, the BRICS, don't be so proud and Western arrogant. You think that's because they're stupid or they're silly little emerging market economies who don't know what they're doing and we've got it all taken care of. That's incredible arrogance. Doesn't mean you're anti-West or anti-American. Certainly Gordon Brown made a huge mistake. Nixon made a huge mistake. Why can't we just admit it? We can still fix it. But again, it goes to the point, your question, yeah, these central banks are stacking gold for a reason. They're not about to do a big jewelry outrun. They're not about to make more wedding rings. That's not their goal. Their goal is the world's going to be dysfunctional. It's already dysfunctional. It's going to get worse. Paper money and U.S. treasuries are not going to save us, and we don't want to rely on that. We don't want that seigniorage, as they call it, where we're the serfs under the U.S. decision, where our monetary and fiscal policy has to follow what the Fed does. We're tired of that, and now we can openly be tired of that because America's gotten so much weaker since 1971 that now we have the right to flex our own muscles collectively. And as a group, we're going to be stronger. And by the way, the BRICS don't all get along with each other, and they're not all uniform in their thinking, and they don't all trust each other, but they do trust gold no matter what. So whether they, and you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They may not love each other in a kumbaya way or trust each other or each other's local currencies from, you know, from the yuan to other currencies, but they do trust that gold component. And they do know that they don't trust America like they used to, because America has been taking advantage of them for over 50 years. And so if I were a third world emerging market economy, or I was a major BRICS player, South Africa, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, I'd do the same thing. So, you know, let's not be cognitive dissonant in the West. Let's not be arrogant. Understand sound money, understand gold, understand inflation, understand currency debasement. You'll understand why these other countries are moving away from the dollar and stacking this pet rock, this indestructible pet rock that's been in our system since before the universe was created. You can't replicate that with bytes in digital form, and you certainly can't replicate that in paper form. And again, it's so obvious to me. And the only thing that scares me, really, Alexei, is that I have too much confidence. And that does scare me, because I was talking with Henrik about this, where we could be wrong, really. Thinking about this as the way I was trained in law school, plaintiff and defense, really trying to see both sides of this. And again, I don't say gold solves every problem, and I don't say gold goes up in price in a straight line, and I don't say there won't be retracements in gold. I just know that pet rock, that analog asset, is far, far more trustworthy than paper money. And that's been known throughout history.
On this note, it's hard to ask anything else but to thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure. You guys took good care of all of us while we were here. It's been a wonderful trip and a really great series of discussions, and I loved every minute of it. So thanks for having me.
It was an absolute pleasure to also meet you. It's always online conversation and stuff, and always staring at a screen. But it's much better to sit with you driving a Cobra.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And having a tour of the Cape Point with a chopper.
Yeah,
and enjoying this fresh beer we're about to pop now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Alexei.